Livestream. I'm actually currently in Ukraine, in Odessa, Mama, and it has been an historic week. At least the recent summit between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin was unprecedented in how it went down and what it all means for the Russo-Ukrainian war. So in today's live stream, I'm just going to react to what happened during the summit and what is likely to happen tomorrow, because Donald Trump is to meet Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in the Oval Office of the White House tomorrow. And it is potentially an ominous day for Ukraine and its efforts to resist Russian aggression. So, as you're aware, since it was such a huge event, broadly covered in all sorts of media, whether it's the alt media or the mainstream media, Donald Trump met Vladimir Putin in the United States. It was in Alaska, although Donald Trump at times seemed a bit confused about that. He did say in the run-up to the meeting that he was going to Russia for some reason. He said it twice. And then when he was leaving, he said he was going to the US. So it seems a bit gotten a little bit confused about where he was exactly, but it did actually almost seem like it was taking place in Russia in terms of the diplomatic protocol, because after they met for their 3-hour meeting, Vladimir Putin took the lead and actually spoke at the, well, it was supposed to be a press conference, but they didn't take any questions, so the announcements to the press afterwards, and he actually spoke for twice as long as Donald Trump. Is about 12 minutes long, 8 minutes of Vladimir Putin rambling on again, and Donald Trump as well then took his turn. So it was quite unprecedented. Normally, diplomatic protocol is that the host of the meeting speaks first, but a lot of things that should happen don't happen during this Trump 2 administration. So basically, Donald Trump had threatened to put on secondary sanctions, which means sanctioning 2 countries that do a lot of business with Russia, namely India and China. And that would have a pretty bad effect on the Russian economy, because then they would lose potentially buyers for their resources, since India and China buy so many of them. It's not really clear to me that the US has the leverage over China in order to really effectively introduce those sanctions against China and India. They've already introduced some sanctions, some secondary sanctions anyways. Well, basically they're sanctioning India, and part of the justification is the fact that they buy resources from Russia and they would potentially be ramped up. And Donald Trump threatened this as a way of trying to have leverage over Vladimir Putin, insisting that there is going to be a ceasefire. Now, the ceasefire idea is quite interesting, because Ukraine has, since Donald Trump came into office, been one of Donald Trump's main clarion calls, is there must be a ceasefire, must end the killing. Sounds quite noble to end the killing, of course. And Zelensky has gone along with this idea in public. However, I suspect that since he was previously against it, he probably actually doesn't really want a ceasefire, because from the Ukrainian point of view, the way they calculate things is that the way to defeat Russia will be by exhausting its capacity to conduct the war. So even though Russia also doesn't want a ceasefire, because their calculation from Vladimir Putin's point of view is that, well, he doesn't really want to stop the war, number one. And number two, he's under pressure that the Ukrainians are just about to break militarily any moment now. So if he just keeps going, that he will get a decisive breakthrough and then be able to force the Ukrainians to capitulate. So actually neither side, because the way they calculate with respect to their strategies, actually wants a ceasefire. But because Joe Biden had drip-fed all this support for Ukraine and actually scheduled a lot of it to come during this first year of the Trump 2 administration, Zelensky has felt compelled, especially after the Oval Office debacle, which is now probably about 4 or 5 months ago at this point, that he has to go along with saying that he'll agree to a ceasefire, because it's a way of ingratiating himself to Donald Trump and his desire to see a ceasefire. So that was the objective, one of the objectives of Trump in terms of having the summit. Normally what happens with summits is the 2 leaders basically meet and most things have been agreed. Here it didn't seem like anything had been agreed, so it's very bizarre to see it take place. And the result was there was no ceasefire. And basically it gave Vladimir Putin a huge diplomatic coup. He was basically brought in from the cold. He got invited with a red carpet meeting with the US president, and he was given that stage and able to demonstrate both to his consistency back home with the Russian public. Look, we're on the same level as the US in the sense that he was given this honor by the US president in Alaska, which has ties to Russian imperialism. It was bought by the US in the second half of the 19th century when the Russian economy was weak. So they sold it, the Tsar sold it to the US for what now seems like a pittance, seems like a really bad deal. But at the time, no one really realized how many resources were in Alaska. And also it was probably going to be very hard for Russia to maintain control over its territories on North America because they didn't have so many forces there to protect it. And of course, you also have the neighboring British colony of Canada at the time that could have come and kicked the Russians out and taken that territory. So they sold it. But it does demonstrate that by choosing Alaska, that was another. The visuals for Vladimir Putin were quite good that he went to Alaska. And also, Trump mixing up his words and saying that he was going to Russia also didn't help because this war is, one of the motivations behind it is Russian imperialism. Just to recap, this war has taken place because Russia sees itself as an empire. It is in effect an empire centered around Moscow. It's not a nation state, and it denies the right of Ukraine to leave the control of that empire, and Ukrainians don't want to be with that Moscow sphere of influence anymore because basically it's a pretty bad deal compared to joining the collective West in inverted commas and basically joining the European Union. If you look at countries like Poland and the three Baltic states, Poland is basically booming and so many Ukrainians have gone there, and it was the fault of the Ukrainian elites in the 90s that didn't express interest in joining the European Union, wanted to stay closer to Moscow, and as a result, well, we can see the economic disparity between, or difference between Ukraine and Poland even before these wars, the Russo-Ukrainian war began in 2014. So that is the root cause of the war, which Vladimir Putin likes to keep referring to the root causes. Root causes is that, well, Russia is an empire. Also, the fact that that Poland and the Baltic states are successful as being part of the European Union, obviously backed up with that Article 5 NATO security guarantee by the US, even if that's a time not clear whether that would actually be helpful if they were invaded by Russia under this Trump administration. But we'll go along for the purpose of today's conversation that it is going to be effective as a deterrence to Russian aggression. That inspired the Ukrainians to want to join the same path, the Euro-Atlantic institutions. Also, the majority of Belarusians wanted to join it. So what do you think would happen if Ukraine and Belarus were to join and be successful? Then people in Moscow would want to get rid of Putinism and the Russian imperial system because, yeah, they would see it being better to be in that style of government, and possibly Russia would disintegrate and parts would join the European Union, and we can only speculate what happened to the rest of it. And this may also be a scenario that takes place regardless. So these are the root causes of the war. And for Vladimir Putin, he has managed to get Donald Trump to be on more or less the same page as him in terms of he doesn't want a ceasefire because of what I already outlined, right? Stopping the war would be pretty disastrous for his control. When Russians tend to say this is existential war, they don't mean it's existential war for Russia or the Russian state. They mean it for the ruling cabal around Vladimir Putin. That's an existential war as far as they're concerned. Now, if they lose the war, then, or they don't come back with a big victory, then their control, their grip on power probably slip because people are going to be very upset. But all the people who died, all the money that was spent, and the fact they didn't even win, so they're going to feel humiliated. And Vladimir Putin could well be ousted. It's a huge risk for him, right? So he doesn't want to even have a ceasefire. He wants a peace agreement, which is basically Ukrainian capitulation, so that Ukraine is unable to leave Russia's sphere of influence and it can be reinvaded and basically controlled by Moscow. It will basically be forced back into Moscow's sphere of influence. That is the goal. And as a result of this meeting today on Truth Social, in anticipation of the meeting with Zelensky. Trump said, yeah, no need to have a ceasefire anymore. He didn't introduce the secondary sanctions like he had threatened before. So again, it's this taco label that he always chickens out. But basically, he found a way around having to impose those secondary sanctions by agreeing to this summit, and then agreeing basically with Putin's point of view that they need a peace agreement. But the difference between the two sides, between the Ukrainian position, app notification. So in terms of what he has agreed to now with this Truth Social post is that basically they will go for a peace agreement. But the difference between the two sides is so big. Ukraine doesn't want to be in Russia's sphere of influence. Moscow insists that it is. And there's no real splitting the difference because things have not been settled militarily, right? War is continuation of politics by other means. So Russia would have loved, Putin would have loved to have just had Ukraine under its control without having the war, but because it can't control it diplomatically or politically, because being in Russia's sphere of influence is such an unattractive option for the Ukrainian elites nowadays and the Ukrainian public, that basically he felt compelled to go to war because he insists on Russia maintaining its imperial control over Ukraine. There's no chance of a peace agreement. Basically, Russia wants capitulation of Ukraine, and Ukraine wants Russia to leave, and Ukraine and Russia are pretty much at an impasse militarily. Russia currently controls a little under 20% of Ukrainian territory, including what they had taken back in 2014. However, their high watermark was around 25% back in mid-20 or early 2022. And at the moment, it is not clear which side would win on the battlefield. The big issue for Ukraine has been that the US has not provided the same level of military assistance or financial assistance they did back at the beginning of the 2022 invasion. And Donald Trump has not authorized any new funding. It's basically what's dripping in is what the Biden administration had already authorized. So from the point of view of Ukraine, they've been looking for alternatives with the European allies and their own domestic production. And it's unclear whether they will be able to produce enough to win the war yet. From Russia's point of view, they're basically been betting on Trump to win the elections and then cut off the support for Ukraine. And that is a big risk with tomorrow's meeting. If that were the case, then in the short to medium term, then Russia could be in a better position to pursue the war. But they have not made a major breakthrough on the battlefield in over, 3 years almost at this point. The limited gains that they made around Pokrovsk basically in the last week, which was seen as a disaster by the Ukrainian military when it happened, well, they basically were soldiers that overran their supply lines, it turns out, and the Ukrainians have already basically surrounded those positions and cut them off from resupply and in the process of mopping them up. So it's probably about 1,000 soldiers will either be captured or killed. Maybe some of them will manage to get back to their own lines, but that advance has been almost completely reversed. And that was the biggest breakthrough in a very long time for Russia, probably the biggest breakthrough since 2022. And that's already been reversed pretty much. So there's no indication about which side will gain the upper hand in the battlefield. However, Ukraine losing US support has made it less likely it's going to be them and basically dragged out the war in all likelihood for many more months and possibly even many more years. So tomorrow is going to be a big day with this meeting between Zelensky and Trump in the Oval Office. The last time it obviously turned into a complete debacle, one of the most disgraceful scenes in diplomacy that certainly I can remember. And there is a big risk going into it that Trump will just present Zelensky with an ultimatum to effectively capitulate. Did see that Steve Witkoff came out with a statement. He is like an advisor to Trump who gets invited to all these meetings in spite of having absolutely no experience or background in diplomacy and looking incredibly incompetent when it comes to dealing with the Russians. He goes in without even his own interpreter, doesn't take notes, doesn't even remember the names of very key towns in Ukraine and parts of the country that he's advocating for Ukraine to just give to Russia. And basically, today, when this short statement I saw before I started this live stream was saying that the Russians are going to put it into their laws that they won't attack Ukraine again. But I mean, it's already illegal. They already gave security assurances back in 1994 with the Budapest Memorandum they wouldn't attack Ukraine. They've signed many more documents since saying, even Vladimir Putin has signed them saying they won't attack Ukraine. So why would it be credible that they just make some new laws saying that, oh, this time we won't attack? That has echoes of the appeasement of Adolf Hitler by Neville Chamberlain with respect to the Sudetenland. Yeah, just give us the Sudetenland, which was an area of Czechoslovakia, and we promise we won't go any further. That's what the Germans promised. And as soon as they got Sudetenland, just shortly afterwards, they just took the whole rest of Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia did not put up a fight. They basically just capitulated, and then, of course, Hitler went on to attack many more countries in Europe. So that is a very bad precedent, and you'd have to be off your rocker if you're the Ukrainian president to believe that just because they put it in Russia's laws that they're not going to invade again. That's absolutely worthless because of how Russia has basically violated all the other promises. Why would you be naive enough to believe them now? But apparently Steve Witkoff is trying to sell it that way. So the big risk tomorrow is that they're given some sort of crazy capitulation ultimatum, and then Zelensky's even come out basically in anticipation of that and said he's not going to accept it, and he will, to presumably Donald Trump's in that situations face, then say no, and we could have a repeat of the debacle we saw last time he was in the Oval Office. So the big risk is that US will not follow through with supplying the rest of what the Biden administration had authorized in terms of support for Kiev, and also stop sharing the intel. This was a major issue back with the Kursk offensive when Russia, the counteroffensive by the Russians to retake the parts of Russia that Ukraine had successfully taken in, it was, I think, back in August 2024. The day that the Russians launched a major counteroffensive that was successful in retaking that territory that is de jure Russia, the US cut off not just the supplies to Ukraine or the material they were sending, but also the intel. And it's hard to know if that was coordinated with the Russians, just a coincidence that the Russians happened to anticipate it, and what the effect was, whether the Russians would have taken it anyways. It's been unclear. However, if that were to happen, that would be a massive issue for Ukraine, and they don't have an alternative to the materiel or to the intelligence of the US military that they're provided at the moment. They have been working on that, especially after what happened with the Kursk counteroffensive. So that is the big risk. It's not for certain that that's what will happen. J.D. Vance says that basically if the Ukrainians and Russians don't make an agreement now, then they'll step away from the whole process. So one scenario is that Trump just throws Ukraine under the bus, metaphorically speaking, and says, okay, I'm not even going to agree to any intelligence hearing or any more material to go to Ukraine, no more support. He could also do something below that and continue the intel support, continue allowing maybe European countries to buy material and then send it to Ukraine. So that would, from his point of view and his base, at least he's making some money for the US to get to, but it would be less arms for Ukraine, and it lacks any real sort of strategic objective that the US is trying to achieve. They're basically leaving it up to fate at that point. They're not trying to influence the situation in terms of do they want Ukraine to win or to hold on, which is what the Biden administration went for in terms of the strategy to create this impasse. So those are the two most likely scenarios. My gut instinct is that at some point, Trump will probably cut off the intel again. Maybe it's going to be tomorrow. Maybe it's not going to be tomorrow. Maybe it's going to be something in between. But seeing as that he is hell-bent on not actually doing much to weaken Russia with respect to what he could do in terms of sanctions or providing military support for Kiev, I would go with probably optimistically being for option 2, that basically the US will walk away from the process and he will throw in the towel on Trump in terms of trying to effectively force Kiev to capitulate, but will allow the intel sharing and for the Europeans to continue to buy US arms and send them to Zelensky afterwards. That would be the optimistic outcome. The pessimistic outcome is that he actually cuts off everything as a result, because if we look at the precedent with the last Oval Office meeting, it did go rather disastrously. Of course, he may just continue to stay in the process and invest more political capital into trying to find a solution, but there just isn't one unless one side is going to lose militarily. That's just the bottom line. There are two positions are diametrically opposed, and at the moment, Russia doesn't look like it has the capacity to drive the Ukrainians out of their own territory successfully militarily, and the Russian economy is in a lot of trouble. As I've been saying for 1 year on this channel, that the second half of 2025 is really going to be crunch for Russia to sell manpower, material, and money. And they are really starting to struggle with respect to money. So at this rate, they probably will be in a lot of trouble sometime around the second quarter of 2026. And there may be a black swan event beforehand. One possible one might be the death of Kadyrov in Chechnya, which may provoke some sort of internal conflict there, and that would drag away resources from the front in Ukraine and maybe force the Moscow to redeploy troops, even to try to stabilize this situation. In any case, probably lots of Chechens who are in the Russian army would go back to Chechnya to fight over the succession battle, and basically the battle is going to take forward there. That's just one example of what could happen. Drop me your comments down below and let me know what you think about the Putin-Trump summit. I'm going to put Putin's name first, since he seemed to be in the driver's seat with respect to that, and what you think will happen in the meeting between Zelensky and Trump. Or I should say Trump and Zelensky. So Trump will definitely be in the driver's seat in that meeting tomorrow in the White House, and what you foresee for both sides militarily, economically, and politically going forward in the next year. I'm going to go out and film my second live stream of the day on my lifestyle channel right now. And, you know, it's kind of, if you've seen the title, it looks quite bleak, but it will have a silver lining. I promise you that. So, Slava Ukraini, this is one of the solutions to the conflict. Make Russia small again. It should really have probably said make Moscow small again, Moscovia. Moscow should go back to its original boundaries, and then we will have the end of Russian imperialism. That is, of course, one long-term solution to the war in the region. So, Slava Ukraini, do перемоги, and see you on the next video.